Yes.
Yeah, and my slides. Okay, reimagining consciousness, an inquiry into consciousness education. So we'll leave time for the moment and go to a really simple little subject of consciousness. To begin, I would like to pose a question to you. You don't have to answer it, don't put it in the chat, but just think on it for a moment. Where do you think consciousness comes from? For me, for most of my life, I knew the answer to that question, and the answer was the brain. And I know I'm not the only one, and I know this is still being reproduced because I have a nephew who, at 10 years old, went through a phase where anytime he was asked a why question, his answer was the brain. So I had no problem with that until I was 36 years old and I suffered a personal loss. My partner suddenly died. And for the first time, I realized the existential implications of an understanding of consciousness as coming from the brain. And because it caused me such despair, I allowed myself to look at the data for the very first time to see, how does the brain create consciousness? What do we understand about this? And I was very surprised to find out that we don't understand much about that. It's a theory based on correlation between brain activity and conscious experience, as a lot of people here, I'm sure, know. Um, but I was surprised to find that out. I thought this was a scientific fact. And then I was even more surprised to find the huge amount of data about our reality that the theory that that the brain produces consciousness cannot explain. So my goal in this presentation is to take you on a little tour through the different categories of data that I discovered when I fell down the rabbit hole of consciousness studies research. And then to get you to my project, my doctoral project, which is how do we teach about this data in schools because it's not there? And what does this data mean? Like, what does it imply for how we teach and learn? And it's a project that I call consciousness education. And I recognize a lot of people in this audience may already be familiar with a lot of this data. So I hope there's something to be gained from how I'm organizing it and just showing the breadth. Also, because it's only a 20-minute presentation, I can't go into detail about every single little thing. So we can talk more in depth about it in the Q&A if there are areas you're less familiar with or you'd like to share more about. Did you see my slide change?
Yes.
Okay, just
Yes.
checking. Okay, so first let's just quickly unpack some of the assumptions that go along with brain-based consciousness, because I don't think we talk about this much in education. So if the brain creates consciousness, then consciousness dies with the brain. It's extinguished. There can be no consciousness before birth or after bodily death. Another assumption, if the brain produces consciousness, then consciousness should be stuck in the brain, right? We shouldn't see perception and communication happening outside of the body's five senses. Because humans have big, beautiful, complicated brains, humans are assumed to have a superior sense of consciousness. And in fact, things in nature with really small brains or no brains at all, we consider to be not conscious. And thoughts are not real in this idea. They are sort of creations of the physical brain, and they should not have any influence on matter, even within the body, but outside of the body. So The first category of experiences that call some of these assumptions into question comes from the survival of human consciousness evidence. And this, I start here because this was my entry point into consciousness studies research. This image is from Jeffrey Mishlov's award-winning essay for the Bigelow Consciousness Institute competition. And he makes an argument called the bundle of arrows, where he says each one of these categories in and of itself isn't necessarily enough to prove that consciousness survives bodily death. But taken all together, these 9 different categories make a very strong case. And I'm not going to go in detail into data from each one. In the next slide, I'll talk about the 2 that I find most compelling, which are near-death experiences with a particular aspect and the reincarnation research. But just briefly to describe, after-death communications are when information is received from a deceased person. Sometimes it can even lead to lost things being found. Picandarian experiences refer to when a living person has a vision of someone who they know to be alive, and it turns out that that vision happened at around the time of that person's death, unbeknownst to the person experiencing the vision. Possession is when a deceased personality or different personality seems to take over a living body. And this is very rare in the literature, happening spontaneously. But a little more common is people can go into trance and intentionally allow a discarnate spirit to take over their body and communicate through them. Instrumental transcommunication is communication through electronic devices such as cameras, phones, computers, etc. Xenoglossy is the sudden ability to speak a language that a person never learned in their normal life. Mental mediumship is the ability to communicate or receive messages from deceased persons. And this has been very thoroughly researched in laboratories recently by Dr. Gary Schwartz and Dr. Julie Beschel, where they have put all sorts of blinders on the process and controlled for fraud and normal means of getting the information. And yet mediums are still able to have verifiable, accurate information that they had no other way of knowing. Physical mediumship is physical manifestations such as noises or objects moving, things like that. That's kind of the most eye-rolly one that's very difficult to wrap our heads around, but there is some research literature that's very compelling about that. So this was my entry point, was the survival research. And the two most compelling for me is the literature of near-death experiences with veridical out-of-body experiences. And what that means is people during a near-death episode claim to leave their body and to be able to perceive what's happening from a space outside their body. And the veridical aspect is that what they see, then when they're back awake and they can report what they saw, it gets verified by people who were there. And these are 3 examples of many on record. And we can, if you have questions, if you're not familiar with any of them, just ask in the Q&A and I can give more details about any of those cases. The young children's past life memories research is very overwhelming in its power, partly because of the quality of the research from Ian Stevenson that's been continued by Jim Tucker out of University of Virginia. But the sheer amount is very hard to dismiss. So it says there's 1,700 solved cases. And what that means is young children, sometimes as young as 2 or 3 or 4, as soon as they can express themselves clearly, report details about a life that they say they had lived before. And what a solved case means is that these researchers, based on the information from the child, were able to find the identity of the person that that life and death described and confirm that there's no way that that child would have been exposed to the details about that person's life. And if you're not familiar with the case of James II, that's one of the more powerful, more famous recent cases in the United States. Another little interesting footnote about reincarnation research is the correspondence of birthmarks on bodies of people who have these memories to the death wounds of the life that they claim to have lived before. Okay, moving on to another category of data. So that's just the survival of consciousness theory that obviously blows the assumption that there is no life before, no consciousness before life or after death. It calls it into question. This category I'm calling phenomenal evidence of anomalous experiences. And anomalous experiences are experiences that materialism just cannot explain, cannot account for, with the idea that the brain creates consciousness. Psi research is a huge category, but it has been shown in laboratories over and over that telepathy, clairvoyance, precognition, and psychokinesis are real. And the researchers they're getting frustrated. They want to figure out more about how it works. How can we cultivate these abilities? What does it mean, right? The bigger questions rather than just the existential ones. Savant syndrome. So savants are people who know things without any previous exposure and without the skills for deriving the answers. And savants, there's many cases on record. There's no good explanation for it, but we know it happens. And savants can either be born, for example, like the pair of autistic twins who John and Michael, who could recite prime numbers up to 20 digits when the computing ability at the time could only go up to 12 digits. And they said the numbers just appeared to them. Or it can be acquired after a head injury, such as a 10-year-old who was hit on the head with a baseball and suddenly was able to solve complex mathematical equations. That goes against that assumption that consciousness and our understanding of things is just locked in the brain and through our senses. Remote viewing is a very well-established ability. It's been funded by the CIA. It's been used by police to find missing persons. But my favorite story comes from Dr. Stephen Schwartz's research and his project from the 1970s called the Alexandria Project, where 2 remote viewers went to Egypt with the goal of locating a particular building in a buried city of Morea. And in a search area of almost 600 square kilometers, we're able to stake the precise location and describe features that were then confirmed when it was excavated. And that's really interesting to me because no one on Earth alive knew these details, right? When these remote viewers were able to perceive it somehow. And then the research literature that's evidence of distance healing. So the power of mind and intention to affect the healing of an individual. And Dr. Larry Dossey's work is very compelling and expansive and impressive on that. But that's not all. Oops, I skipped a slide, sorry. Okay, another category are observations of matter behaving in inexplicable ways according to the Newtonian paradigm and the assumptions that we have about reality. Dr. Ian McGilchrist already touched on entanglement, and I was going to mention the Nobel Prize, so now I don't have to do that. But this is the idea that bonded particles, when separated, still seem to be able to communicate with each other across space. The wave particle duality and the observer effect is even more mind-blowing to me. And this is where a photon or electron can behave as either a wave in more than one space and time at once, or as a particle that's measurable. And through the double slit experiment that's been replicated so many times that this is a well-established principle, it seems that the act of measuring somehow causes the particle or the photon to appear as a particle, to appear measurable. So somehow observing affects the collapse of the wave function into a precise location in space-time, which is quite mind-blowing if you think about the implications of that, which we don't a lot, especially in education. Brain entrainment, it's kind of similar, the same concept as entanglement in a sense, but at a human brain level, where brain scanning, EEG, MRI shows that when people are bonded, either through emotional attachment or through meditating together, and then separated into different electromagnetically shielded rooms, their brain imaging can mirror each other. And when one is stimulated, one's brain is stimulated in a certain way, it registers on the separate individual, even though they didn't receive that same sensory stimulation. And shout out to Rupert Sheldrake's work on morphic resonance, which is a theory to go towards explaining some of the mysterious behavior of animals that science doesn't have a great explanation for. And his theory is that, and there's a lot of research to support it, that species behave in ways that suggest they have an interconnected group mind and some kind of telepathic ability to communicate with each other, and that this goes beyond just a group of animals within a species to the whole species. There's a species field, and then it goes across generations beyond what can be explained just genetically. And there's an interesting experiment that's been replicated involving 32 generations of rats solving a maze, and how quickly subsequent generations learn. Just one of a lot of studies that support his theory. Add to all of this the historical and cross-cultural reports of mystical experiences and events from around the globe throughout human history that in our modern blink of an eye, we just dismiss as delusions, hallucinations, and mythology. And I wonder, is there more to that? So all of this has led me, as a layperson, my background is teaching creative nonfiction writing at the University of Toronto. But when I stumbled down this hole and learned all these things, I started to change my understanding of consciousness to an idea of consciousness beyond the brain. And if we just unpack some of those assumptions, we see that it actually fits more of this data, or can allow for more of this data. So for example, if the brain filters, there's a theory that the brain acts more of like a filter of consciousness than a producer, like a radio or a television set receives a signal. If you hear that, that's my dog coming down the stairs, sorry. And you can see how this idea allows for individual consciousness to survive potentially bodily death if it's not created by the brain, but rather is the brain is receiving consciousness from another source. We could understand consciousness acting in non-local ways, so perception and communication occurring beyond the senses of the body. We could change our assumptions or reconsider them at least about nature and its level of consciousness and our relationship to other species. And we could rethink how we think about our thoughts. They may be much more powerful than assumed by the old paradigm. So encountering this data was a huge part of my personal transformation in my worldview. It wasn't the only part. Um, I also had my own anomalous experiences, and I also listened to many, many stories of other people's anomalous experiences that would fall outside of scientific research. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there amongst people. And the combination of those three things, my experience, stories of other people's experience, and scientific research data, has led to a transformation in my understanding of consciousness. So now my research brings this to education. And my question is, how might educators challenge the context of present day mainstream science and philosophy in ways that help students to open their minds to the possibility that consciousness may exist beyond the brain? So I'm doing a narrative inquiry with scholars who teach about consciousness beyond the brain in the university. And I'm including scholars that hold different cultural and philosophical perspectives. So my working definition of consciousness education is education about perspectives on the origin and nature of consciousness and their implications for ways of being, knowing, teaching, and learning. And I think it has two aspects. How do we shift the paradigm within education, like about what we teach about reality? And also, what are the implications of this new understanding of consciousness for how we teach and learn? So just to close, just to come back to that first question, where does consciousness come from? My answer now is a delighted and wonder-filled, I don't know. Thank you very much.